Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People story. I couldn't believe my eyes when I opened the letter from the Homeowners Association. They were suing me for $50,000 for parking my car in my own driveway. The letter claimed that my 15-year-old Toyota was an eyesore and violated Homeowners Association rules about having unsightly vehicles visible from the street. At first, I thought it was some kind of sick joke. I'm an 86-year-old widow living on a fixed income. $50,000 might as well be $5 million to me. There's no way I could afford to pay a fine like that. Not for doing something as harmless as parking my car where I've always parked it. I've lived in this neighborhood for over 30 years and never had any issues before. When my husband was alive, we were one of the first families to move into the development. Back then, the Homeowners Association wasn't nearly as strict. But over the years, new people moved in and got on the board, and they just kept adding more and more petty rules. I called up Richard, the current Homeowners Association president, to try and straighten things out, but he refused to budge. He said my car was an eyesore and depressing property values, so I had to keep it in the garage or cover it up. The nerve of this guy trying to tell me what to do on my own property. I explained that the garage was full of my late husband's tools and workshop equipment, and I used my Toyota to drive myself to doctor appointments, the grocery store, and to visit friends. I needed it to be accessible, not buried behind a pile of boxes in the garage. Richard wouldn't listen to reason. He emphasized that the Homeowners Association had every right to regulate what residents did on their property, and if I didn't comply with the rules, I'd have to pay the consequences. Well, I'd had enough of being bullied by these Homeowners Association tyrants. I decided to fight back. With the help of my neighbor Jim, we went door to door in the community asking if anyone else had issues with the Homeowners Association. We discovered many people were fed up, but were too afraid to speak up. The Homeowners Association board members had a reputation for harassing and fining anyone who challenged them. Jim and I started an email group for Homeowners Association members to discuss problems and strategy. We used it to organize an emergency Homeowners Association meeting, gathering enough proxy votes from our neighbors to hit the quorum requirement. At the meeting, we confronted the board about their underhanded tactics. Many residents spoke up about feeling intimidated and bullied, and how the Homeowners Association leaders were abusing their power just to force their personal preferences on the neighborhood. We called a vote to disband the entire Homeowners Association board. In a landslide decision, the current board members were removed on the spot. Elections were held, and Jim and I and a few other reasonable neighbors were voted as the new Homeowners Association board. Our first act was to void any unfair fines and repeal the most frivolous Homeowners Association rules. No more would residents live in fear over what color they could paint their door, or whether their grass was the approved height. As for Richard, the former Homeowners Association president, we sent him a letter informing him that the $50,000 fine he tried to levy on me was completely dismissed. We also let him know that under the new board, his personal vehicles would have to meet the same standards he held me to. So he ended up having to sell his junky old SUV that was an eyesore sitting in his driveway. The new Homeowners Association board restored a sense of community and reasonable governance to our neighborhood, and I was so grateful to have the help of Jim and other neighbors stand up for me against the Homeowners Association bullies. In the end, the little old lady didn't have to pay a dime, and we got the sweetest revenge seeing Richard forced to sell his own ugly car. It just goes to show you shouldn't mess with a determined group of feisty senior citizens. The next one is a pro-revenge story. Let's call him Joe. I have to call him something. The man I ruined, but I can't call him by his real name, so let's call him Joe. Joe was a wife beater. I was hired by Joe's brother-in-law, the brother of the wife that Joe beat. My client was also Joe's ex-business partner. Aside from the whole "you beat up my sister" thing, my client had another beef with Joe, a serious business beef. My client took it to court and gave me the case to handle. Joe and his lawyers fought me long and hard. Joe was confident that his BS and outright perjury would carry the day. It had always worked before. His BS and his fists had won him a good settlement with his ex-wife, free of child support, so maybe he thought that threats and lies would carry the day once more. But he was wrong, and after the trial I had a judgment against him. A big judgment, far bigger than he could pay. Joe twisted and turned and shimmied and shook, but after a while I'd located and taken all his assets. It was easy, really. Joe had no thought of consequences, and so he didn't lawyer up until it was too late. If one of my clients ever sues you, you're in trouble because my clients lawyer up before they even know your name. But Joe didn't lawyer up until the process server threw the papers at his feet, and by then it was far too late. I went through Joe's assets like a meat grinder, and after a while, Joe had but one property left, a house, and he clung to that house, for it was rented out and his sole source of income. Joe lived in the unfinished basement, and he survived on what the upstairs tenants paid him. He cashed their rent checks at payday loan places, paying hefty fees, but it was worth it because he knew that I'd garnish any bank account that he opened. Joe managed to hide his rental place from me for a while because he owned it through a numbered company, but my investigator found him one day and followed him home. Joe self-repped his way through the next stage, which took a couple of years, while I punctured his corporate veils and his sad efforts at fraudulent conveyance. But in the end, I had his last house, the house where he lived in the unfinished basement. Joe stepped out one day to get a pack of cigarettes, and when he came back, the sheriff had changed the locks. "Can my client at least live in the basement?" Joe's lawyer said to me, pro bono, because by this point, Joe had nothing to pay lawyers. I knew the pro bono guy. He practiced law nearby. As I was talking to him, I could see pro bono guy's office window across the parking lot from my office tower window. "Ask the purchaser," I said. "It's out of my hands." And it was. I told Joe's lawyer that the new owner, a nominee, one of my client's employees, wouldn't let him back into his crappy basement apartment. Joe, a man who had owned this and that here and there and all over town, had just lost the last thing he owned on earth. Except for his truck. He still had his truck left. Joe's truck was this big-ass gas-guzzling beast that he drove around in. It was too old and too frail to be worth seizing, so I let Joe keep it, and I was glad I did that because now the truck was where Joe slept. Until he made a mistake and lost his truck, too. He lost his truck the day I got a phone call from the tenants at the house that Joe used to own. He came back and parked his truck across the driveway, the tenant said, adding that Joe had gone nuts. He'd parked his truck there in a rage out of spite and then walked into town, saying he'd be back later that day to sleep in his truck. "Can you get around the truck?" I asked. The tenant could not. The driveway was blocked. I called one of the tow truck guys that I used to defend back in my criminal lawyer days, and in a couple of hours that truck was gone and parked somewhere else, somewhere special, in accordance with my specific instructions. "My guy wants his truck back," the pro bono lawyer said the next day when he called me. "Not happening," I said. I stood in my office 15 floors above the parking lot and looked down where I imagined my pro bono counterpart was standing in his office facing the same lot. "But you have no right to the truck," he said. "He has no right to block a man's driveway," I replied. It was terrible, really, standing up high, pronouncing words that took away a man's final asset, the last thing he owned on earth. I imagined that this must be what God feels like before he strips a man of everything and sends him to hell. "Are you really going to make me go to court over this?" said pro bono guy. "Do what you gotta do," I said, and pro bono guy said his client was coming in the next day to sign an affidavit, and then they were going to court to get the truck back. But I was unconcerned. The next day was bright, the sun was shining, and it was 9 a.m. as I looked out the window and sipped my coffee. My phone rang. I picked up. It was pro bono man. "Why didn't you tell me that Joe's truck was parked right outside my office?" His voice was tight, and I could tell that he must have been shaking with anger. "Is that so?" I said, staring out at Joe's truck parked 15 stories below me. "How careless of my bailiff to leave the truck where your client could easily take it back. I really must speak to him." "Very funny, my client's going to sue." "No, he isn't. He's going to get in that truck and drive away right now. I told my tow guy to fill up the tank, and he gave it an oil change too, gratis. Tell your client to get in his truck and drive off, and that if I ever see that truck again, I'll seize it to satisfy the rest of my client's judgment." Pro bono guy tried to argue, but I was firm. Then I put the phone down and picked up my coffee. A few minutes later, Joe walked out of his lawyer's office and over to his truck. As he walked, I saw that there was no longer a bounce in his step. The joy had gone out of him. Joe wasn't the first guy I ruined, and he won't be the last, but he is the only one whose final ruin I witnessed from on high, from my office. And it was one of the most powerful experiences of my life, watching a man walk to his truck, knowing that I had stripped him of everything else he had, and that he owed his possession of his last asset, his truck, to my mercy. Joe drove away, his big-ass ancient truck spilling clouds of smoke from the exhaust. I was pretty sure I'd never hear from him again, and I never did. The next one is a petty revenge story. Every year, the company I worked for had a huge fundraising campaign. They solicited voluntary contributions from all employees, deducted directly from their pre-tax paychecks. Employees were encouraged and heavily pressured to donate to pre-selected charities in smaller monthly amounts for the year or as a lump sum. There were numerous email reminders and signs all over the company walls. They even offered prize drawings, although the prizes were invariably won by company executives and leadership. The company maintained running totals for each department to track the number of contributors. They aimed for 100% participation from all departments. The system was meant to be private and anonymous, displaying only numbers. However, I quickly realized it wasn't as anonymous or voluntary as advertised. If one or two people held back, administrators would approach them and pressure them to participate. What was truly strange was that the administrator of my department, who was typically stoic and stern, became unusually enthusiastic about the charity campaign, which raised suspicions. One year, I was in a difficult financial situation, so I wasn't planning to contribute. I was really strapped for cash. However, the administrator came into the office suite exclaiming, "We're almost at 100% participation." She clapped and seemed giddy, glancing around the room and questioning each person. She kept her eyes on me and slowly made her way over. When she reached my desk, she asked, "Have you made your contribution yet?" Instead of politely declining, I, without much thought, should have told her it was a personal matter. I informed her that I was still considering which charity to support. She pulled up a chair and started sharing a sob story from one of the charities, explaining how the money helped those in need. She asked me to visit the charity website and guided me through making a contribution. As a young and naive worker, I complied with her essentially forced request and made a minimal donation of $24 per year at $2 per month for my meager salary. This donation helped our department reach 100% participation, but it didn't feel voluntary. The following year, I intentionally waited until the last moment to make my contribution to see if I would have the same one-on-one conversation with the administrator. As expected, she approached me with the same memorized sob story and walked me through making my contribution while watching me closely. I soon realized she was targeting me and trying to push me out of my job. She isolated me from colleagues I got along with, including my direct boss, and made me report directly to her. I knew I had to leave that department quickly to protect my job security. I applied for other positions and transferred to another department within a few weeks. It turned out to be a fantastic move and one of my favorite positions to date. In my new department, they organized and managed various company, city, and county-wide events, with one of the largest being the charity campaign for the entire company. I mentioned to my new colleagues how peculiar the previous administrator had been during that time of year. They informed me that she was striving for 100% participation because administrators received a bonus when their departments achieved it. I made sure to share this information with everyone in my former department. The following year, that department had one of the lowest participation rates. Since I was in a better place in life and genuinely liked my new department and leadership, I willingly contributed because the new administrator used the bonus to treat everyone to lunch or express gratitude in some form. The next one is a malicious compliance story. About 10 or so years ago, I went to a concert an hour away from me in Indianapolis. I decided to make a day of it by visiting several museums and spots around the city. Each time, I paid for parking in a garage for about 2 hours and then went to meander around the area. Finally, I parked close to the venue and paid for parking until it was free. In total, I probably paid $40 to $50 for parking throughout the day. I enjoyed the concert, but when I returned to my car, I found a parking ticket on it. I thought, this is odd, but I was tired and chalked it up to a mistake. However, I decided to take photos of my parking spot. Both spots on either side were taken, and all the signage, and then headed home for the evening, figuring I would sort it out in the morning. The next morning, I reviewed the ticket, the photo of my spot, and my parking receipt. The ticket did not match the spot where my car was located, and my receipt showed that I had valid parking at the time of the ticket. So I submitted an appeal, thinking it would be easy since it was obvious that a mistake was made. Unfortunately, the appeal was denied. The ticket was for the spot that was not paid for, so it stood. I called the office, and the lady said they did not make a mistake because my receipt showed that I paid for spot X1 and the ticket was for spot X. I asked about the photo proof that my car was in spot X1. She said, "Well, you could have moved the car." Note that the parking receipt included my license plate number and everything. Think Parkmobile-like system. I pointed out that there were cars in spots on either side of me and that the entire street was full because of the concert, and honestly, I don't think they bothered to look at the photo. Even if that had not been the case, I had proof that the license plate had a paid parking spot. No matter what, no dice. At this point, I was feeling petty over this $25 parking ticket, so I called Visa and asked if I could dispute the amount I paid for the time that I had parked since it didn't count. I submitted all the evidence and documentation to Visa. In what was the greatest thing Visa has ever done, in my opinion, they agreed that if my parking receipt and transaction number weren't proof that I'd paid for parking, then clearly I had paid for a service I did not receive. They extended my initial request to include canceling all the parking transactions I had made through the system that day, valued at more than the parking ticket. Then they filed a formal complaint on my behalf with a letter explaining why they were refunding me. It wouldn't have been nearly as satisfying if I had not spent the entire day playing tourist in the city and racking up a large parking bill, all with the same vendor. The next one is an entitled people story. I own a house a couple of houses down from a school, so this was bound to happen eventually. When it's time for the kids to go home, my street is lined bumper to bumper with parents picking up their kids, and the sidewalks are full of families who walk all the way to their cars. I often have to pick up balloons, snack packaging, old homework worksheets, and general garbage that the kids drop. If you're trying to get home around the time school lets out, there's no way you're going to be able to get there before the blockade the parents make is gone. This has been a problem the few years we've lived here. There are two places the kids let out: my street, which is a small cul-de-sac with the school at the top, and a main road that's open all the way down to a baseball park with a wider road to allow street parking and two-way driving. Obviously, if you can't find parking, the tiny residential road isn't the way to go. There are 3 cars at my home: my car, my roommate's car, and my husband's utility van, which he parks on the road to avoid blocking our roommate since she's frequently in and out. Fridays, today, I work from home. So, when I finished work, I poked my head out the window to look at my fruit tree I have near my driveway. It's spring, I keep excitedly looking for blooms, and I noticed a big white Buick SUV in the middle of my driveway, blocking both spots for my car, which my husband was using since I was home, and my roommate's spot. Honestly, why would you park in somebody's driveway? So on top of these entitled parents blocking up our small residential road, this person decided to take up a private residence's driveway. I got on the phone with the non-emergency police line and took pictures of the vehicle and plate. Then I got my husband's keys and backed his vehicle up to block the SUV into my driveway, and I waited. 15 minutes later, the mom, bug-eye sunglasses, big old diamonds on her jewelry, and wearing athleisure, comes around to hop in the driver's seat and smiles and waves at me sitting on my steps. Honestly, she probably thought I was the homeowner's kid or something because I'm in my early 20s rather than the homeowner. Hi, hope you don't mind. Me: You're trespassing. Why would you park in a private driveway? Sorry, won't do it again, we were just leaving. She was being really dismissive and avoiding eye contact despite taking the sunglasses off. Me: I don't care, you have no right to park on my property. I'm on the phone with the police. It was just for a second, I was just picking up my daughter. Me: It doesn't matter. You don't live here. You don't park here. At this point, I realize the non-emergency police aren't going to pick up, so I hang up and decide to mess with her a bit. She got in her SUV and dismissively waved at me, so I got in my vehicle that was blocking her in and waited, pretending to still be on the phone. She starts trying to back out of my driveway because there's a little bit of a gap between my utility van and my neighbor's car, but it was definitely too small for this Buick. I would like to point out this vehicle has a scuffed front bumper, so I had a feeling she has no spatial awareness outside of her backup camera. Every time she backed up, I honked, still pretending to be on the phone. She tried again. I honked again. She looked at my grass, and I was about to start recording her in case she tried to go through my front yard. I honked again. If she kept trying to back out and hit my big-ass utility van, she would certainly lose. She gets out of her SUV and comes up to my van, recognizing she can't do anything without making it far worse for herself. Her face was visibly patchy from the distress, and she asked again, are you really calling the police? Me. Yes, you're illegally parked on my private property. That's illegal. I don't care if it's for 5 seconds, don't do it. You don't live here. Her kid got out of the car and I decided that was enough, so I waited for her to get back in her SUV, and I parked my van back in its rightful spot and let her out. After that, I called the school and gave them the license plate number. Nothing will probably come of it, but I don't think she'll park in someone's driveway again anytime soon. I'll take the a-hole points because there's a child involved, but you shouldn't put your child in situations like this anyway. The next one is an entitled parent story. I unfortunately had to move back home with my dad, long story. His home has solar, and he pays about $89 a month for the panels, but considers it a bill that should be shared. And since he pays for it, he feels entitled to control my electricity usage. I tried to keep my usage to a reasonable level, or what I perceived was a level he felt reasonable. I sometimes sat in my room in the dark during peak hours, or I kept the air conditioning at around 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Eventually, a panel stopped functioning and he didn't keep track of each panel's output. Long story short, it resulted in a $500 electricity bill at the end of the year. Before he made the discovery, he continually yelled at me and blamed me for energy consumption because he noticed the monthly electricity bill started to add up since the panels weren't producing enough energy to keep up. He just assumed I was using a lot of electricity while he was at work and didn't even bother to check to see if the panels were functioning. I do use most of the energy, I'm home a lot more than he is, so I agreed to pay for that bill. I figured that would stop his constant complaining, but it didn't. He finally decided to check out the panel's output and saw that a panel was down, which contributed to that $500 bill. I kept my mouth shut to keep the peace, but I was fuming on the inside. The following year, again, he says he sees the bill rising and that it isn't due to a broken panel, so I told him not to worry and just give me the bill when it arrives. I figured that would be the end of it since he knows he won't be responsible for any balance at the end of the year. I was wrong. He still feels entitled to control whatever electricity I use. I do pay him rent on top of the electricity bill, so I don't see what the issue is. He says since he pays that $89 a month for the panels, he can control my electricity usage because he thinks he's being nice by not asking me to pay half. I was looking forward to decorating outside for Halloween and giving out candy. I decorated last Halloween and dressed up to give candy out. The kids absolutely loved it, and it made me feel it was all worth the effort. He said no because of the electricity usage. Keep in mind most of my decorations use batteries or are solar powered. The only energy consumption is with the LED rope lights I put on the ground to light up the walkway. Halloween is my favorite holiday, and once again he takes the opportunity to crush my spirit. I have so many similar stories. This is just a small example of his controlling behavior. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.